talk is about durability, which is, for some of you might be familiar with the term fatigue resistance in endurance sports. And so fatigue resistance is something that we sort of bandied about as a term, but globally now durability is durability is now the accepted term going forward. And this is the field that my PhD student who graduated last year, James Spragg, his entire thesis was on this. So we've contributed 4 or 5 publications in the last 2 years in this area. But it's a very rapidly evolving area. And so lots of publications in the past 5 years, and particularly the last 24 months. And so we're trying to understand what that is. Just as a precursor, just to update everyone on where we are at UAE Team Emirates at the moment. I joined the team in mid-2018, and this is our win count on a yearly basis. We're now 2/3 of the way through the season, and we're on 64 wins, which means we're going to exceed our former target, which was last year's 57 wins by some margin. This is a week old, that's why it says 63, because we've had another win since. Second place team in the world rankings is Lidl Trek with 30 wins and 61 podiums. We're on 64 wins and now 144 podiums. So we're beating the second place team by a fair margin. And it's great to see the continued improvement. And it's just an amalgamation of more and more small factors that change things over time. And we've already got a list of a dozen things that we need to improve on next year. So hopefully we can continue that trend. So then on to the topic, durability. Durability, just to understand the concept, my slides are back to front here. I'll go in reverse. If you look at, and Andrew, for you in running, you have your critical running speed, and you have your now well-recognized running velocity time duration curve, and it's the same in cycling. Fatigue is a very complex phenomena. So many of our researchers in our division have contributed to understanding fatigue in the last 20 years. But as our research grows, we learn that we know less and less, and it is incredibly complex, all the different mechanisms that underpin fatigue during sports and during daily activities as well, and endurance sport. But we can distill the physiological processes down in mathematical modeling to be able to try to understand what's happening from a mathematical perspective. And one of those ways is to look at the time that you can sustain a particular workload. So if I do a maximal effort for 10 seconds versus 1 hour versus 2 hours, I'll be able to produce power output for that duration. And that's your power duration curve. And that happens to have a hyperbolic relationship to linear time. And what we see is that in a quasi-steady state, and I say quasi because if you exercise forever, you will eventually stop. But for a period of anywhere from 30 minutes to 4 or 5 hours, you can sustain pretty much one intensity, varies depending on the level of the individual. And that happens to coincide with the asymptote of a hyperbolic relationship between time and power linearly. That's difficult to understand. So if you do a logarithmic time curve and then a linear power curve, you get what we call a two-tailed exponential decay function, which is easier to see. And this flat portion coincides with the asymptote of a hyperbolic curve. So it's easier to understand and this is sort of the duration that you can see that this is here, this is 7 minutes, and this is an hour. So between 7 minutes and an hour, it's pretty steady state. And that is quite synonymous with something called critical power, or in Andrew's case, critical running velocity, which happens to be where metabolic processes are in a relative steady state. Now, if I go and do a number of efforts over a week or 2 weeks, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, 2 minutes, we can then plot that curve. And we do that practically with athletes. And we see that it's very reproducible. And each athlete has their own power duration curve. What happens, though, is that during a single exercise bout, if you do, for instance, a race, or if an athlete does a particular training session, and at the end of the training session tries to replicate their best effort on a power duration curve. So whatever they happen to do, whether they do a 30-second sprint, or they do 5 minutes maximally, or a 30-minute maximal effort, what we see is that that power duration curve no longer matches up. There's a decline in their ability to produce a particular effort. And that decline is what we're looking at when we talk about durability. And durability refers to your ability to maintain this original state, physiological state, for as long as possible. And when you look at cycling performance, and even if you're looking at marathon racing or other physiological feats in endurance sport, the determinant of the outcome of the race is often based on how well you can perform in the final half an hour or hour of a race. And in cycling, that's particularly the case. So durability is a critical component of cycling performance. And yet we understand it really, really poorly. And now we're starting to understand it with the research that's being generated. So if we look at some of the, Peter Leo is a co-author on many of the papers that we've published, and a close colleague of mine. And he's been the most prolific in this field. James is obviously the PhD student that I was talking about, and they both in professional cycling. And if we look at what we know about durability, what we see is that durability is different depending on the individual and their unique physiological characteristics. And we see that riders who are part of the general classification, so Tadej Pogačar and riders that in the Tour de France, for instance, are trying to win the overall race and need to lose as little time to their competitors on any given day, they have very high levels of durability. And if we ask them to do a power duration effort when they're fresh versus having used 1,000 kilojoules of energy, 1,500 kilojoules, all the way through to 3,000 kilojoules, and we now actually measure over 4,500 kilojoules. So to give you an idea, a 4,500 kilojoule effort is what we see in a 200-kilometer Tour de France stage when it covers 5 horse category climbs or 4 horse category climbs or similar. So the horse category climbs are climbs like Alpe d'Huez, the Col de Bonnet, and so on. To give you perspective on that, you may know, for instance, Kloof Nek in town, okay? Kloof Nek is about 1/10 to 1/15 the vertical climbing of a horse category climb. So those climbs, and they will do 4 of those in a stage before. So you're talking about climbing from Camps Bay High School to the top of Kloof Nek and down about 50 times before you get to 4,500 kilojoules, and doing that at a pace competitive with the top 20 athletes in the world. Okay, so it's a huge amount of energy, and yet, even after expending all of that energy, the top athletes are able to produce the same performances that they would if they were fresh out of the gate. And that's what we try to aim for. But we see that all-rounders, and particularly sprinters, who have a different muscle fiber type composition, do not have durability. And in their cases, you don't necessarily want them to be the most durable because it may affect their sprinting performance. So we see quite a wide spectrum of durability. We also see that durability is most affected, it affects mostly your higher intensity efforts. So this is fresh, and this is moving through to 45 kilojoules per kilogram body mass. So that's just measuring your energy expenditure relative to body mass. But what we see is that the shorter durations are affected much more than the longer duration efforts. So durability seems to be impaired more with more stochastic, higher intensity kind of activity. We see that over the progression from under 23 to professional teams and to World Tour teams, which is the highest level, like Premier League football, World Tour is really the top level. It's the top 15 teams globally. We see that durability progressively improves as athletes move through those levels. So as they get older and as they are exposed to better training techniques, they also become more durable. And it's actually one of the reasons why the UCI introduced the under 23 category in the early 90s, because they realized that junior athletes coming through would suffer and may have adverse health consequences if they're forced to do, for instance, Paris-Roubaix or the Tour of Flanders or some similar races because of the huge demand on them. So the first question is, how do we measure durability? And that's where we really started in terms of understanding and standardizing the methodology. And one thing we do is we take a whole bunch of data from any given year or many years, and we throw it into analysis systems, and we get a power duration curve for every single best effort that a rider has done for the last year or 6 months or 9 months or whatever we decide. And that's what we call power profiling. And power profiling is useful because it means that we don't have to ask them to do a specific test. We see what they've done in training and competition, and then we get an idea. But it does have problems. And the problem is that many times the data that's sitting in the system may not have been a maximal effort at that given time or in general. They may have done a maximal effort for 5 minutes and then had a recovery period after that. And if we look at a 7-minute mean maximal power output, 2 minutes of that is recovery and 5 minutes is maximal. So it's not necessarily a maximal effort, and the duration is not necessarily in keeping with what we're looking for. The problem with field testing is that when we do this, you're looking at a spectrum from 0 seconds to 5 hours and everything in between. And you only have a number of opportunities to measure that. If you're doing, for instance, a field test on 3 consecutive days, you could probably do 5 data points on that curve and then try to plot the gaps between them. And if you're doing it to do durability, you're having to fatigue the athlete before and then do the measurement. And you can only do that once or twice in a week, and it interferes with training. So you get limited data. It's aversive. The athlete doesn't like doing it. It interferes with their training, and if they're racing in particular, you can't do it. It's time consuming and difficult, and it disrupts the process. So we need to try and find a balance between those. And then we have to ask, well, when do we measure durability? Is it after the athlete's done 2,500 or 3,000 or 3,500 or 4,000 kilojoules? Which is the one that's valid? How do we set that cutoff? And the reality is it depends on the athlete's level. We may need to have a cutoff for juniors that's 2,500 kilojoules, for elites at 3,000, for professionals at 3,500, and World Tour 4,000. And we sometimes do that in practice, but we need to try and standardize that across researchers and in the field practically. And if we use absolute values, a big 90-kilogram rider could easily do that kind of workload and not really be that fatigued, whereas a 55-kilogram rider would have to do, relative to his body mass, a lot more work. But if we do it relative to body mass, then the lighter rider is going to do that more easily, and the heavier athlete is going to struggle. So it penalizes larger athletes. We published 2 years ago our compound score and showed that it's the most valid method to assess performance in under 23 riders and predicts performance and wins in the under 23 category with a positive predictive value of 83%. So it's a very valid indicator. And so that is your absolute power multiplied by your relative power. And so we may have to come up with a compound work score. In other words, 120,000 kilojoules squared per kilogram body mass or something similar. It's technically challenging, but it probably has greater validity. But that's something that we need to assess and then see if we can come up with a set of values that will actually be valid and usable going forward. We know that if you do a higher total energy consumption before you measure durability, you're going to get greater sensitivity, because the weaker athlete is going to be more affected than the stronger athlete. You're going to have a greater difference. So you're going to get a higher statistical significance. But higher values also mean that when you're doing power profiling, grabbing all of the data, there's very few instances when an athlete has actually exerted themselves to that extent. For example, in the Tour de France this year, only 2 days were more than 4,500 kilojoules. And last year, 2 days were 4,500 kilojoules. But the second day that was 4,500 kilojoules lost us the Tour de France. That was the day that Tadej cracked on and lost a number of minutes, 4 minutes, to Jonas Vingegaard, and ended up losing the Tour de France. So they're very important days, but they're very few and far between. So you have these scattered data sets. And we also know that if you do a field test, and you ask an athlete to do that, they don't like doing it because 4,500 kilojoules means that they come home very spent, and they're not going to like to do that very often. We know also from recent research by Peter Leo and James with other researchers and our own research, this was one of James's PhD papers, that the intensity of the work is more important than the duration. And in fact, if you model that, all of the research that's done with exercise workloads that are constant, below or at critical power, do not affect durability much. As soon as you do workloads above critical power, it starts to affect durability. And it seems now that accumulated work done above critical power is the single biggest predictor of whether there's a disruption of durability or not. And so that's important when setting the kind of workloads to assess durability. And then interpretation of the results is also important. As I already alluded to, sprinters, because they don't have a muscle fiber type composition that's very durable, in other words, slow twitch muscle fibers, which are mostly oxidative, are going to be able to generate energy for long periods of time by their nature without having a semi-permanent disruption of their capacity, whereas type 2 glycolytic fibers are going to be fatigued quite easily. But you need those to do a sprint. And so if you change a sprinter to being an extremely durable athlete, they may not win the sprint at the end of the race. And so that's something that you also have to take into account. So what we use, and I think it's a fairly valid approach, is that we use, so if you're familiar with cycling, functional threshold power is basically that quasi-steady state, which we measure with a 20-minute time trial, effectively, or 20-minute time to protocol. And if you base it on FTP, you're already standardizing for body mass because the FTP value will be relative to that athlete's maximal workload. And we do a protocol that involves 5 efforts at 110% of functional threshold power, so above critical power, of 8 minutes duration with a 15-minute sub-critical power recovery period. And this was based on the protocol used in James's PhD, which we also published as one of the methods to assess critical power, and that showed that this was compared to a continuous workload at critical power, which had very little effect on durability compared to this. So it's a valid protocol. And then after that, you do 2 or 3 maximal efforts. And you can only do 2 or 3 because each of those affects the durability as well. And doing those then to create data points to connect on the power duration curve. So that's the protocol that we suggest is maybe a way forward to standardize things. And this is highly sensitive data, so I've redacted the actual value, but this is taking our compound score. So this is watts squared per kilogram body mass. And then, so you're talking about relative workload multiplied by absolute workload, and then looking at durability using the protocol that I've showed just now, and looking at the decline. So in other words, a lower percentage here is a loss of power relative to fresh, and after doing that workload that I've just showed you. And this is all of the athletes in UAE Team Emirates. And what we see, these two are sprinters. Okay, so you see the sprinters are not durable, and that's a good thing because that makes them good sprinters. And then the rest are a group of either all-rounders that can win races, semi-good sprinters, but are pretty able to get over climbs. And then you get really the race winners. And almost every single one of our race winners is either one of these two or in this area here. Okay? And I won't leave you guessing as to who this is, and you might be able to figure out who this and this and this is. But it's a very valid technique to stratify performance. And by looking at the spectrum, we get an idea, and that means that we can take an athlete and who's a potential signee onto a pro team, and we can do this protocol, and we can assess where they fit into this particular spectrum. And this is just one. So we'd have a number of these spectrums for 3 minutes, 12 minutes, 20 minutes, for instance, and then we can create a spectrum of performance for each of those durations. And that tells us whether the person's potentially a one-day race winner or potentially a Tour de France kind of a GC type winner, but it's a very useful technique. What are the determinants of durability? There are probably an end of the spectrum. And it is literally all of the different things that contribute to fatigue. And so if we want to improve durability, we need to try to address all of them. So there are physiological aspects, such as your cardiovascular system, your stroke volume, your capillary density, your respiratory system, your metabolic training status, what your mitochondrial mass is, your muscle fiber type composition and hypertrophy and so forth. There are important nutritional strategies, and our athletes now use a nutritional strategy when the pace is high of between 110 and 120 grams of multiple transportable carbohydrates. And all the research shows that that is now what is a valid nutritional approach. It's 110. So to put that into perspective, you've probably all run a half marathon and had those little energy gels. Hey? You're talking about 4 energy gels and a 500 ml bottle of energy drink every hour. Okay, and they managed to absorb that. Okay. Psychological factors are very important because if you've done 4,500 kilojoules of work, mental resilience is going to be a big factor. So you have to take into account personalities, neurodivergent athletes. What do you do with them? They can't be in a group environment having to try and translate what everybody's trying to tell them and working through their mental energy, and the next day going on a 4,500 kilojoule mountain stage and trying to be at the end. By the time they get to the third climb, their mental energy's gone and they switch off and they disappear out the back. Physiologically, they're still fine. Mentally, they're empty. So you have to work on psychological strategies within the team to manage those athletes. Many of the top endurance cyclists, because it's an individual sport, are individuals who could not achieve high levels in team sports because they didn't have the tools at that time or ever to work in a team environment. So they drift into individual sports, triathlon and cycling, and they become really good. But those problems that kept them out of team sports can then become a factor that limits their performance at the highest level in cycling. And so you need to manage them. So you have to have a strong support team and effective team dynamics. We use mindfulness and relaxation techniques to reduce anxiety and improve focus. But even in the people that are not neurodivergent and have great coping skills, you can still enhance performance. Pacing strategy is very important because, as I said, the efforts that you do above critical power affect durability. So you've got to, within the team dynamic, understand how you're going to manage the dynamics of the race. If so-and-so from Jumbo Visma disappears up the road, how are we going to manage that to reduce the effect on durability enough to make sure that we still have energy at the end of the race and so forth? So strategies and skills are very important and a big part of cycling. Technological advances are a huge part. One of the biggest developments and why the riders are now going so fast and able to do the efforts they are is because if you take a bike from this year and you take one from 20 years ago and you ride that over a 40-kilometer variable terrain, the difference is about 5 minutes. And even a bike, and we've taken our team bikes from 2 or 3 years ago, and we've compared the performance, and on a single climb of 15 kilometers in duration, the difference is about a minute and a half. So the technological changes are a huge part of the advancement in performance. And if you save energy over a 4 or 5 hour period, that accumulates to the final effort when you finally get to that point. Environmental considerations are very important. Heat adaptation protocols, because the Tour de France happens in July. We have global warming. We have record temperatures. And so heat adaptation protocols are becoming a huge part of performance. And we've implemented those quite successfully in the last year and a half. And we've seen that obviously this year with Tadej Pogacar's turnaround. And altitude acclimation, that's a universal phenomenon now, but optimizing altitude acclimation is really an art. And we've spent years trying to refine that into get the best possible. And we measure hemoglobin mass with carbon monoxide rebreathing to be able to understand whether or not our protocol is optimized or not. And we then refine it further. So these are all these things that happen. From interest from a physiology perspective, because we're the division of physiology here, We look at what laboratory characteristics are important, and our own research has been actually probably the only valid research that's contributed to that, because there have been 3 other studies. Our research was the only one that used a protocol with stochastic efforts above critical power. The other 3 studies all used a continuous workload at or below critical power. And so their findings may not be relevant. And our findings were the only ones that correlated durability with peak power output, VO2 max, the respiratory compensation point power per kilogram body mass, the first ventilatory turn point, both absolute and relative power, gross economy, and carbohydrate oxidation rates. And so by virtue of that, inversely, your fat oxidation rate, so your substrate use. So there are some physiological determinants that we're starting to see. One of the factors that has to be investigated more is functional strength. Once again, Peter Lear, he's a prolific publisher, and looking at the transition from under 23 to professional to world tour, we see that the amount of torque that athletes can produce increases very much from under 23 to professional, and in some instances, well, not really from professional to world tour. So as an athlete develops from junior to under 23 to professional, they have an increase in their ability to produce torque. So strength, in other words, is a very important factor. And obviously, if you've got strong muscles, they fatigue less. But if I just take 3 athletes from our team, and I've redacted it again because it's sensitive data, but if we look at this athlete, and we look at the maximal power they could produce for a particular duration, this is quite a long duration, after 3,500 kilojoules of energy expenditure. So in other words, assessing durability specifically. And we look at what their mean maximal torque is. So this is the maximal torque they produced for a 4-minute period at any time during that year. And we see this athlete, we see that initially, and this is when they were 19 years old, when they were 20, they became stronger. But they never did any strength work, off or on the bike. And in the subsequent years, their strength declined. Their durability declined as well, improved a little bit because they were doing other factors to try and offset their loss of strength. But then when we introduced strength training this season, their durability jumped by about, 15%, so, which is a massive improvement. Okay. This cyclist had strength work right from the beginning. This is then when they were 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 years old. And we see that they reach a peak torque of 1.29. And this is what we know to be roughly the upper limit for 4 minutes. So that's a very, very strong cyclist. And what we see is that their durability continues to increase progressively. And this is due to other adaptations, but their strength. And this one, not to belabor the point, same story, no strength at all. And what we see is they initially improve, and in the last 2 seasons decline because they haven't incorporated enough strength work. And there's more data to support that, which I'll show you in a second. So how do we train for durability? What do we know that we need to do? Well, we see, once again, from Peter Leo, as you can see, he's everywhere. I don't know how he gets the time to do that, but he somehow manages to publish with everybody in the field all the time. But if we look at under 23 athletes versus non-elite athletes, so this is professional stroke elite athletes versus non-elite athletes, and we look at the training that they're doing, we see that this is the percentage decline. So this is if they can do the same fresh versus tired, and so any drop down is bad. And we see that the non-elite athletes have more of a drop-off for 2, 5, and 12-minute efforts. And if we look at the differences in training, we see that the elite group do a much greater amount of time in hours in zone 1. So zone 1 is your typical 3-zone model, and zone 1 is below your first ventilatory turn point, is a rough guide for that. And we see that if we look at total cycling time, we see the same here for the power output in zone 1. So it's not that they are better athletes, they are not only spending more total time in that heart rate based zone, but their power in that zone is also much higher. So zone 1 training, low intensity endurance. So 20 years ago, we went on a complete opposite direction, and polarized became everything, and everybody was doing research into polarized training and the Norwegian model and others, 4-minute maximal efforts times 4 or 6 or 8. We now see that in actual fact, you do need a good deal of training and volume-based training in zone 1. If we look at Nikki Alker's data, looking at juniors, Scandinavian juniors, all the way through from junior through to senior, men and women, we see that their durability improves over that period. And if we look at all these different factors, VO2 max, peak power, and critical power improve in women. This is mainly due to increases in body mass as they move from junior to senior. In relative terms, they don't. And so that's except when they go from junior to under 23. So there are some physiological changes that happen from junior to under 23 level that support that. So to suggest that VO2 max is a factor, but then from under 23 to senior, it doesn't change anymore. And this is something that I'll highlight in the next slide as well, but it's something that we've also seen over time with all of our athletes and over the last 20 years that we've been involved with athletes. What we do see though, is that the lactate, the power produced at 4 millimolar lactate continues to increase, and at 2 millimolar as well. So power output at different lactate concentrations increases, and that correlates highly with durability. Gross economy also improves from junior to under 23, but then tapers off. And that changes even when they're fatigued, and it's very similar. And their pedaling efficiency shows the same. They improve in their kinematic aspects, but then that plateaus once you reach under 23. And the men show a very similar scenario. And what that tells us is that once you've reached about 21 years of age, your VO2 max reaches a peak, it doesn't improve. And we've seen this for over many years. When we were doing lab tests in 2003, 2004, and we tried to identify factors that we could use to predict performance, we measured VO2 max in our lab on everybody. And we saw that it actually didn't predict performance. We had guys who come into the lab who'd have a VO2 max of 77, 78, and then they'd go to a race and they'd be nowhere. And the guy who had a value of 74 would win the race. Why? Because VO2 max is very good at stratifying population groups into performance, but in a homogeneous group of athletes over the age of 21, it doesn't predict performance. And this is actually, I can't tell you who this is because that would not be nice, but this is an athlete who's won a Grand Tour. And this is data from my colleague Inigo San Milan, who tested him over a number of years. This is 2009, this is 2011, and his VO2 max did not change at all. Absolutely the same value. But if you look at his lactate curve, it changed quite significantly. And that is an increase in mitochondrial capacity, an increase in oxidative capacity, in lactate redistribution and efflux from working muscle, and then reuptake in other areas. So an improvement in metabolic capacity. And that is what still develops from athletes moving from under 23 through to elite. The cardiovascular respiratory capacity is already at a maximal. It's their metabolic capacity that improves. And if we look at functional strength, once again, Peter Leo is there, the other researchers, and he deserves many awards. But we see that strength increases over time, and I've shown you the other data as well in terms of our own athletes. So strength training, and we've done that, specifically done interventions to improve strength, and it's one of the things we did with Tade last year, and that has been one of the factors for his dramatic improvement this year. He was declining in strength, and we incorporated a lot more functional strength work. What about within a season and the training? We're almost at the end now, by the way, so I'm going to wrap up in a few minutes. But training within a season, this is also from James's thesis, complicated graph. I'll put it into succinct fashion. There were positive correlations with the degree of polarization of training and the amount of time spent below the first ventilatory turn point. So that adds to its basic replication of what we see in Nikki Alker's data, and our data seems to confirm that time So it wasn't the Alpha's data, sorry, it's the data from, was it Peter's study? But time spent below the first ventilatory turn point, as that accumulates, there's an improvement in durability, but also the polarization index of the training. So in other words, not doing too many moderate duration efforts, but doing a lot of low intensity volume and then doing high quality interval training seems to correlate best with performance within a season. So as you know, and that's one of the problems with all of the racing that we do. Our athletes do hundreds of races each year, not each of them, but each athlete does anywhere from 45 to 70 plus races in a year. And those are racing days. They have to travel between races as well. And the season only starts, some of the races start in January, but the season really kicks off in March and it ends in August. So you're talking about March, April, May, June, July, August, 6 months. Some of the races are in September, but very few. So over a 6-month period, you've got to try and fit in somewhere between 50 and 70 races, and you've got to travel between them. And the problem becomes is that fitting in high quality training between those races is a factor that affects performance. And so what we did 3 years ago already is look at the calendar and say each athlete needs a period to build up, they need a period to race, and they actually need to withdraw. And we withdraw the athletes from racing for a period of up to a month at a time to allow them to go home, to train effectively, to get more recovery mentally and be with their family and basically recharge the battery, and then bring them back for another battery of racing. And that's worked very, very effectively to enhance performance. There have been some other studies, I'm going to just gloss over them because methodologically they're flawed. So there are still big gaps in the training specific aspects that relate to durability. And so that then brings us to the end where we have a summary. And to summarize, measuring durability is very complex. There's currently no consensus or standardized measure. We need to develop that and agree to that. Maybe we need another two-year-long Delphi study. The determinants of durability are still not entirely clear, but they're starting to emerge from the fog. Type 1 fiber type predominance is definitely a factor. Strength is an emerging factor, but we need randomized control studies. There was one that was just published. Mike, you were here. What was the outcome of that? It wasn't on durability, but it was just overall performance. The one that was published last week on strength was.
Yes, or no, what just showing the benefits of strength training overall performance.
Correct, yeah. And that was off the bike strength training, yeah. So strength is a definitely emerging factor. And then they're conflicting evidence for other determinants, but we need to do more research, as is normally the case. Training for durability is not 100% clear. Definitely increased time in zone 1 is important. Zone 2 training may be beneficial, but the evidence is limited. High intensity interval training is probably beneficial, but quality evidence is limited. And functional strength training is probably beneficial, but as I said, evidence is limited. So in total, more research is needed. And so it's a big gap. And so if anybody's interested in this, take the time to delve into it and we can start finding out more about this emerging concept. Thanks for your time.